For a moment, James couldn't do much more than stare at the captain. The huge primate's dark eyes fixated him in a very predatorial way for someone who usually prided himself on being a gentle herbivore. James would have loved to interrogate the captain about just how he would come to ask such a question, since it should have been pretty much impossible for Uton to know about the events of the last day. But he also reminded himself that he was supposed to play the role of the clueless goofball right now, which was more important, at least for the time being. So the question that he actually asked with a feigned embarrassment was, "Guess gossip travels quickly on a ship like this, huh?"
"It does, and I do love myself some gossip," Uton replied with only a hint of amusement breaking through his grave tone. "But please, James, like I said, the question was serious."
James let out a deep, conceding breath and shook his head. "Well, it depends on what you mean," he said, still refusing to match the serious tone of the situation with his voice. "If you are asking if I woke up with a face full of hair today, the answer is yes. If you are asking whether we've checked just how compatible our species really are, the answer is no." Uton kept his dark gaze on him a bit longer, and James knew he was trying to look past the surface. He didn't let it bother him. He was telling the truth, and even if he didn't, he had nothing to blame himself for. "I have to say I'm disappointed," James finally said, while giving the captain a strict look. "You don't believe me, do you?" The captain seemed to be taken aback by that, his eyes widening and his expression changing ever so slightly. James guessed he wasn't used to any backsass on board of his own ship, but even as a crew member, James wasn't under his direct command, and he felt like testing his limits today.
"I am still trying to decide on that," Uton answered, and brought his hands back to the ground while leaning forward and bringing his face a bit closer to James.
James let out a sigh and finally changed to a tone that was more befitting of talking to his captain, as he responded. "Sir, I'm an adult man, and more than mature enough to take responsibility, and credit I might add, for my actions. If I was sleeping with Shida, I wouldn't try to hide it." Then he crossed his arms and leaned back a bit, changing his tone even more, now going from his respected, matter-of-fact voice to one he might use while interrogating a group of children about who stole the last piece of candy out of the jar. I have to wonder though, sir, why are you asking just me about this?" he pondered out loud, and now it was his turn to fixate the captain with his dark eyes. "Shida was just here. She could have easily supported my story or debunked it if I was lying to you." To his surprise, his demeanour had much more of an effect on the huge man than he had expected. He could see a hint of embarrassment creeping into the gaze of the captain, who suddenly had a much harder time keeping up the eye contact with him.
"I can't just ask her something like that,"
Uton said uncomfortably, his right hand starting to grip random parts of his fur and pulling them through his fingers. James wouldn't let it go that easily, though, seeing as he had clearly struck gold with his inquiry, and he quickly pried further. "Why not? She is your officer, isn't she? Wouldn't it be your duty to ask about something like that if it was a problem?" Uton looked appalled at the idea, and gave James an almost horrified look.
"Of course not," he exclaimed. "A question like that would be highly inappropriate towards her, or anyone under my command."
Oh, how the turns had tabled. "Then why are you asking me?" James countered immediately, and he feigned taking offence at that statement, as he started to enjoy slowly reeling the captain in. If the question is inappropriate, we clearly wouldn't have broken any rules if we did. Whatever the big man was hiding, he was going to get it out of him.
"Well, no, it's not against any rules, but—"
The captain stammered, his hair pulling becoming more frantic by the moment. By now he wasn't able to keep eye contact for more than seconds at a time. James had never seen him this flustered. "But what?" James demanded slowly and strictly, his face turning stony. Uton stopped pulling his own fur as he brought his hands up, defensively shielding himself from James's berating with them.
"Fine, you win,"
he yelled out, waving his protective hands around a bit.
"You're right, I apologize. I should have approached this better. Just please don't tell her about this."
James loosened his arms from the firm hold he had held them in during the conversation, and brought his hands behind the back of his head. Non-Earthlings really lacked a good bit of fortitude. "That depends on what you are going to tell me now, sir," he confidently stated, letting the victorious satisfaction he felt seep deeply into his voice. Uton sank into himself and shifted his legs into a more comfortable sitting position, while taking a deep breath.
"James, I don't know if you know this, since you are pretty new to our ship. he slowly started, and his voice had changed to a very sincere tone that tempted even James to believe everything that was coming out of his mouth now. But among my crew, even at her young age, Shida has seniority over most other members that are with us today, including many that outrank her. James couldn't tell where he was going with this. Normally he would have guessed that this meant Shida had to be held to a higher standard or something like that, but knowing the general view of the crew, that was unlikely. He wanted to ask about it, but the captain indicated with a gesture to let him finish first. What I am saying is, Shida has been on board of this ship for a very long time. In fact, she started as a cadet only shortly after I had first taken command over the GES-32, he continued, a clear sense of nostalgia in his voice. Back then she was skittish, aggressive, competitive, and overall a real hassle to work with, but most of all, she was determined. That sounded like Shida all right, although James wasn't so sure about the back then part of the story. But looking at the dreaming face of the captain, whose mind was clearly wandering while he told his story, it slowly began to become clear to him why the captain had such an interest in his and Shida's relationship. To her, that she had made it on board of this ship was a clear sign that her determination and efforts were not wasted. Uton further retold their story, and the nostalgia in his voice was now accompanied by a clear feeling of pride. And under my command and guidance, she absolved her training and her education. Despite many adversities, I have personally seen her climb the ranks all the way up to where she is now, granting her every promotion with a real sense of accomplishment. With that, the dark eyes of the captain focused back down onto James, now able to effortlessly return his gaze, while James couldn't keep a soft smile off his face. What a big softy. She may never have been, and most likely never will be, a perfect model officer, but she has earned her place despite her nature. And, knowing how hard things have often been for her here on board, I am concerned for her. Do you understand that? Uton finished his speech, looking at James with an honest expression, and clearly very self-conscious about his behaviour. James couldn't help but chuckle while looking back into those dark eyes. He didn't quite know what to feel, being torn between amusement, honest empathy, and a hint of annoyance. You're afraid that I'm going to steal your daughter away, he said, almost unbelievingly, and still with a hint of laughter in his voice, ignoring Uton's question. He had heard about stuff like this before, of course, read about it in books and seen it in movies, but it was so unfitting for this specific situation that he just had to laugh. Uton also laughed, deeper and more restrained than James. Is it that obvious? He asked in a deep half-whisper. It is now, James confirmed, and let his arms sink back to his sides. But I don't think you have to worry. It's like I told you, we just slept, nothing more. To be honest, somehow that almost makes it worse, the captain laughingly admitted, before lifting himself off the ground with his arms, swinging his legs back onto their feet. Walk with me a moment, will you? James nodded, and gestured for the captain to lead the way. He wasn't exactly thrilled about having to walk around like this, still covered in the mix of chemicals he had been drenched with, but he would indulge the captain for now. Uton leisurely walked on all fours. His head was pretty much at James's height like this, so they could continue their conversation easily while walking. The crew members in the halls respectively made way once they saw the captain approaching, so the two of them could keep a constant pace. James slowly began to wonder where they were going, when Uton finally spoke up again. James, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, but you are aware that you and Shida, despite looking very similar, belong to very different peoples, said the captain to the biologist. James mocked lightly, while trotting along with him. Yes, I'm aware. Why you bring it up? The captain sighed lightly, and James could see in his periphery that he moved his lips around while thinking. Well, things like this are a complicated matter, you know, especially considering your unique situations. Usually I'd even be medically concerned, but I'm sure you've got that part covered, he said uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to tactfully approach the subject. I think what I am trying to tell you is be careful. Some things can be easily misinterpreted. Something clicked inside James's brain. Even though he couldn't exactly say what it was, the captain was trying to tell him something that went deeper than their current conversation. He was sure of it. Sadly, if even the captain wasn't saying it straight out, he could hardly ask for clarification, so he decided to just keep it in mind
and think it over for some time. Outwardly, he merely answered, "Oh, I know, but I'm sure her and I are on the same page." He tried to give Uton an understanding look, hoping he could indicate that he had picked up on the text between the lines. The captain seemed to understand. At least James hoped that that was what his expression meant.
"Well, you two certainly have gotten close,"
he said, now in a more normal conversational tone again.
"Even if not in a sexual way. I mean, you somehow felt the need to sleep in one bed. It always would have made more sense if the two of you were just hooking up. Well, at least she seems to be happy since you came around."
"Oh, well, you know," James answered, and sheepishly scratched the stubble on his cheek. It just kind of turned out that way. It felt a bit weird talking to what now equated to Shida's father in his mind about this kind of thing, so he left it at that, not wanting to go further into it if not strictly necessary.
"It is a bit hard to believe that," Uton responded. "Then again, Shida isn't the only one you seem to have taken a liking to."
James hoped that was just a poor choice of words, and the captain wasn't trying to imply anything with that. He intentionally pretended that he didn't see anything wrong with that statement when he replied, "Life on board would be pretty boring if I didn't make any friends, don't you think?"
"That it would," Uton agreed amusedly. "But you seem to have an especially interesting taste in the people you surround yourself with."
Without missing a beat, James answered, "This is about Curie, isn't it?" Uton looked at him with big eyes and asked,
"Who?"
Right, he probably didn't know them by that nickname. A cyborg. Black, about this tall, 7 limbs. Sound familiar?" he explained, using his arms to indicate the height he was talking about. He tried to see if Uton's expression changed with the mentioning of Curie, but he didn't pick up on anything. Uton moved his head around understandingly.
"Yes, I am familiar," he replied thoughtfully. "You seem to have a way with people that others can't seem to interact with."
More like people others didn't want to interact with. And then again, he really wasn't seeking his friends out like that. It just kind of happened to him. He also knew plenty of people that fit in with others just fine. "Well, I guess being a Deathworlder and hard to interact with myself, it comes with the territory," he mumbled absently. Uton perked up at that. His head rose a bit, and he turned towards James with a peppy expression, his tail starting to move around behind his back.
"Oh, come now. Give yourself a bit more credit," he said loudly, as if publicly announcing it, taking James by surprise. "You are remarkably well integrated when you want to be. Don't think that I don't know that all your little incidents are either theatrics or minor slip-ups on your part."
James didn't know about that. It was true that he was playing up the fish-out-of-water shtick a bit, at least most of the time, but he still felt like he hadn't quite grasped the entirety of the communal culture, even after months on board. Also, why the hell would someone say it like that of all ways? He bashfully scratched the back of his head and avoided Uton's eyes. Unearned praise never sat quite right with him.
"Do trust me on this, James. You will make a remarkable addition to the community," Uton continued happily, and James could have sworn that there was once again a hint of something more in his voice that met the eye. Or ear. "I'm sure," James answered half-heartedly, and feigned a smile towards Uton. Suddenly, while taking a look at his surroundings, he realized where he was. After not really having to watch where he was going for the first time in weeks, he hadn't really been paying attention, and was quite surprised to find himself standing in front of his own cabin door. "I think I have kept you long enough now,"
Uton amusedly stated, giving him a sly look as he was apparently very pleased with himself. And deservedly so, this time he had gotten James.
"Get yourself cleaned up and maybe take some time off. You've had quite the day after all."
James nodded and saluted the captain, who responded in kind. Then he bowed his head for a moment and started towards his door. The captain turned to take his leave, and then stopped again. Turning his head, he apparently decided to add something else.
"By the way, we will reach the GCS soon," he informed James in a passing tone. "I thought I'd let you know. Shida always takes so long to prepare for stops because of her clothes and all that, so I felt you might also appreciate a heads up."
James thanked Uton with a gesture, before turning back to his door. He quickly checked if the toothpick was still in place, which it was, before he opened it and immediately rushed into his shower, just about managing to lock the cabin door behind him. By now his skin felt dry and brittle, as the chemicals had dried on it. His hair was crusted together and his uniform stuck to his body. The words of Uton also still rang in his mind. there was something going on behind the scenes. He already knew that much. It was just a question of just how the captain was involved in it. Also, if he really was that attached to Shida, why did James still get the feeling that he wasn't exactly on her side most of the time? And now he had also gotten something new to worry about. With them being back in comms range, he should have expected as much. After all, it had meant they were back in the galactic plane. But confirmation that they were nearing the GCS of all places right now did fill him with excitement that threatened to drown out his more important thoughts. It also threw a wrench into some of his plans. The Great Community Station, uncreatively as it may have been named, was the oldest space station built entirely as a communal effort by the galactic community, and was located right in the main transit routes of the core worlds. Therefore, it held great importance as a hub for cultural and political exchange. It was also the first stop the GES-32 would make, after it had picked him up in the Sol system, using it to refuel and resupply, while also granting the crew an opportunity for rest and relaxation. A perfect opportunity to get some well-needed enrichment. And with it being the first real off-world site James would get to see after leaving Earth, he was understandably excited. His intrusive thoughts, of course, immediately told him that finding out what was going on behind closed doors could also wait until after his vacation was done and over with, but as usual he snuffed them out pretty quickly. He could do both, kick ass and have a good time. Although with most of the crew being away from the ship soon, there were a bunch of new variables to consider, especially since he didn't exactly know what kind of accommodations they would inhabit for their time at the station. It would probably be a good idea to ask someone who had been on the ship for longer and made the trip before. Luckily his options weren't limited on that front, and he now has something to tell Shida anyway. "I still can't believe he actually did that," Shida grumbled sometime later, in a mixture of annoyance and embarrassment. It was pretty much scandalous that the captain would try to corner James like that, especially on a matter that didn't concern him in the slightest. Where and how she spent her nights was her business and hers alone. Well, maybe hers and that of whoever she decided to spend it with, she thought, with a glance at James. He seemed to be taking the situation with his typical brand of dismissive humour, looking at her with a sense of calm amusement, or training alongside her. The two of them were on their way to the administrative area of the ship. After his chat with the captain, James had sent around messages to their little syndicate, telling all of them how they would soon reach the GCS, and how they should totally make plans together. Not the subtlest of fronts, but effective enough. Technically, it wasn't even a lie. However, not everything could always align with the humans' wishes, and there was plenty of work to go around on board. Pippa was once again busy in medical and couldn't join. Curie said that they would much rather focus on the task already given to them at the moment, and Moore hadn't reacted, which, knowing her, most likely meant that she was currently asleep. That just left Quiz, who Shida had only briefly met before. But James also seemed to be unable to get a hold of them, even if he gave no reason as to why that may be. That way, they were stuck with just the two of them for the moment, which made it hard to plan anything. Shida couldn't complain though. With them approaching the station and therefore a docking process being imminent, she would very soon have her work cut out for her, which meant overtime. And spending the remaining time she had before things got busy by hanging out and maybe getting a couple extra hours of sleep in sounded a lot nicer than the alternative. And, having been told by the captain himself to take the rest of the day off, James had agreed to come along with her, while she requested leave for their time on the station. "Maybe don't tell him that I told you about that," he said, in an impish tone while scratching his neck. Of course she wouldn't have to tell him. If James's suspicions about the captain being informed about their surveillance were true, although Shida still had her doubts about that, the captain being in on espionage and sabotage on his own ship just didn't fit. Shida looked at James sternly. She would have really liked for him to take a little more offence to the situation. Then again, she didn't really know how the topic of sex was usually handled among humans, apart from the few things he had told her during that movie. "And hey, look on the bright side of things," James continued, interrupting her train of thought. "Now you can sleep over as much as you like without any more questions coming up." Shida felt a bit of agitation rising within her, but she knew that it wouldn't do her any good to now also get angry at James. Instead, she decided that this was the perfect setup to fluster him a little. "Oh, you'd like that, wouldn't you?" she said with a sly look, and suggestively fluttered her ears at him, noticing too late that the gesture probably didn't tell him anything. James still seemed to get the gist of what she was trying to do. However, the mischievous look on his face told her that he wouldn't get uncomfortable quite so easily. "And what if I said yes?" he responded, stepping ever so slightly closer and nudging against her shoulder with his own. Shida put a finger to her lips, contemplating it for a second. If it was a game James wanted, a game he would get. Wrapping her arms around his left elbow, she leaned her head on his shoulder and started cooing in his ear. "Who knows? Maybe I'd like that too." This got not only James's attention, but also that of everyone around them. If the rumour mill hadn't been going full force yet, it would now. Shida could see many of her colleagues casting sneaky glances at the two of them, as they closely strolled past them. James let out a deep laugh and seemed to think about his next action while looking at her. And indeed, maybe one step more would be a step too far. Then again, if neither of them was backing down, then neither could blame the other. "So, are you going to make a move?" Shida facetiously said, feeling warm wafts of air sweep over her face with each breath he took. "Or are you just going to stare into my eyes a little longer?" For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to become tangible. Shida could still feel the many eyes of the people around them on her. Usually that would have bothered her, but right now, it was nothing but a footnote in the back of her mind. James did indeed make a move, gently loosening his arms from her grip and wrapping it around her hip instead, pulling her in even closer. Their eye contact remained unbroken, as they kept walking, their legs running on autopilot. Suddenly their awareness simultaneously kicked back in, their peripheries as well as other senses informing them that they were about to meet an obstacle. Mildly startled, they looked before themselves and onto a line of people that had formed along the hallway. Many people were either leaning or sitting against the walls, all of them wearing yellow identifiers and seemingly waiting for something. Shida recognized most of them. And now, a large number of their eyes were staring at the two of them, locked tightly in their little competition of who would back down first. It seemed, without realizing it, they had already reached their destination. With all of the tension between them having dissipated now, James let go of Shida and conceded. "Oh well, fun's over, I guess." Shida felt a sting of disappointment. Even though she was pretty sure that she had just won their little struggle, she wasn't satisfied with that ending. So she decided to make one last victorious move, just to bring it home. Grabbing James once more and pulling herself up towards his ear, she whispered right into it. "Guess we'll have to continue that undisturbed later. How does tonight sound?" James broke out into dry laughter and answered, "Well, we'll have to get done here first, so get going already." With that, she gently pushed away from his shoulder and forwards towards the office, where she would have to officially get her request for leave permitted. Of course, there wasn't much she could get going towards, since there were clearly quite a few people in line before her. Thankfully, the size of the crowd that had formed was misleading, since every person only spent very little time within the office. Most processes were largely electronical, and the visit at the office was only a last formality since everything had to be officially approved, and the process needed to be attestable. Most likely, they wouldn't have to wait for long. Now that the two of them clearly had become fully aware of their surroundings again, most of the surrounding people had started to find exceeding interest in either the floor, the walls, or the ceiling, studying them intently. "You know, on Earth all of this would be horribly improper," James noted, as he looked around at the people lounging in the hall while waiting. "Everybody here would get reprimanded for their behaviour." "Well, on Dunya, you could never get soldiers to actually show up for something like this," Shida responded, already getting bored and wanting to get it over with. "When they tell you that they are taking leave, they will, and you can't stop them." James chuckled. Then he seemed to trail off for a moment as he asked, "Speaking of which, you think they're going to approve your request?" Shida sighed slowly and combed her hair away from her face with her hand. "Well, in the end, they can do what they want, so I can't say for 100%, she replied. "But they're going to have a hard time in justifying denying it." James seemed to become more interested. He stopped watching the crew members surrounding them and focused back on her as he inquired, "And why is that?" She didn't know why exactly, but Shida felt almost a bit embarrassed about that question. She sheepishly avoided his eyes, now throwing the same interested gaze towards the wall as the people around them were doing. Well, I may or may not have accrued quite a bit of unused leave for some time now, she confessed bashfully, her fingers gliding through the fur of her tail to keep them occupied. But it would be nice not working while we're at the station for once and getting to explore it a bit. Working? James asked confusedly. Well, yeah. Or did you think that the ship handles itself while we docked? Shida responded, her confidence returning to her with a mocking chuckle. A minimal crew has to stay behind to manage and oversee everything. Usually I just volunteered for it. In what she had by now learned to be a gesture of disbelief, James raised a single eyebrow. How noble of you? He commented, while eyeing her suspiciously. Oh, please, Shida replied, baring her teeth annoyedly. Staying on board with a minimal crew of professionals is much more bearable than being gawked at by strangers on the space station, especially when I have some juniors to order around. James laughed and put a hand over his heart, while feigning emotionality. I am touched that you would give that up for me, he said, while giving her big kitten eyes. Giving him a sweet look back, she softly put her hand on his shoulder, and slowly extended her claws through his clothes and onto his skin. She could see that it hurt in his eyes, but he tried to act like it didn't bother him, his face only slowly contorting in pain. Only after she felt that she had to be piercing his skin by now, he finally yielded and sank down, away from her claws. Fine, I get it, he laughed, while rubbing his hurt shoulder. But I mean it, I'm glad that you're coming along. Shida sighed and shook her head. Well, stuff doesn't get boring around you, she said, and gave him a wink. He just smiled back at her. Their little display had the unintended effect of making the hall fall very silent. Apparently nobody wanted to accidentally pull their attention towards them by making any kind of noise. She really didn't know what these people expected her to do every time this happened. They always seemed to jump around between being confident enough to openly hate her and being too afraid to even talk when she was near. Many of these people had been serving with her for many months now, and they still acted like she regularly tore people apart. Weirdly enough, many of those same people seemed to only remember that James was about as dangerous as she was, when she was also around to remind them of that. James seemed to be able to read her thoughts in her face while she gazed around, since he quickly spoke back up after taking a look at her. So, how does this whole thing go anyway? He asked, clearly struggling to swiftly find a new topic of conversation. Are we just on our own after we docked? Overall, a pretty dumb question, and James knew that. But it was sweet that he was willing to make an idiot out of himself to distract her. No, of course not, she answered, and tried to at least sound amused. Command will have accommodations prepared for us. Once we are on the station, the captain and his team will go and get us checked in. Once he's done, we will get our rooms. Supposing that at least one of them was colluding with the spies, this also meant that they would have plenty of time to bug their rooms, long before they could do anything about it. And this time, they wouldn't be able to get rid of them undetectably. Or maybe they could. Looking at James, an idea began to form in her mind. She thought about his question, as well as the nosy looks they had gotten earlier, as they had locked arms. Unless, she ruminatively said, and started to creep closer to him, just as she had done earlier. Unless? James asked, and looked at her questioningly, not quite picking up on what she was trying to do just yet. Well, the rooms will be quite standard, and we will be surrounded by crewmates left and right, she said, and purposely played up the flirtatious tone in her voice, trying to get him to play along again, now even wrapping her tail around his hips. So maybe we should look for something more intimate to stay at. James's eyes glanced around. The walls apparently weren't quite so interesting anymore, as all the eyes in the room seemed to gravitate towards the two of them. It finally seemed to click for him. Oh? He asked, now seemingly also getting his flirt back on. And what did you have in mind? He pulled her closer, while his eyes clearly showed his interest in what she had to say, without a hint of his outward bravado. That depends. Shida kept up her act, putting her head on his shoulder and glancing up at his face. What do your finances look like? James chuckled deeply. Well, I am not underpaid, he replied, apparently putting his all into making it sound as much like bragging as possible. Shida couldn't help but think that, if he was anything like the act he was putting on in reality, she would probably hate his guts. "Then I am sure we will find some cozy place with just the two of us," she murmured up to him. By now they had gotten the room excited enough that she could even hear very hushed whispers being exchanged within the crowd. "Sounds nice," James responded, lifting one arm to stroke through her hair. She could see on his face that he was fighting back laughter by now, the corners of his mouth slightly twitching. It also wasn't easy for her to keep up her wooing facade with a straight face, especially not with the people around them apparently completely buying it. Who knew that they could use gossip so practically? Slowly, she loosened herself from James again, throwing a last, suggestive look, and saying, "Then, it's a date." "You know it," James replied with an offhand gesture. After that, they resumed their normal behaviour again. However, they clearly had set something in motion, as the soft whispers around them did not stop with their little act. Perhaps she should warn the captain ahead of time, thinking how he might react if news reached him on the same way the previous had. Or maybe she shouldn't, letting it serve as a lesson that it wasn't his business. No matter what she did, she wouldn't do it right now, as her assistant let out a sound, informing her that she was next in line by now, and should enter the office. She quickly excused herself and stepped over towards the big door. The sign next to it merely said, "Administration." It opened in front of her, allowing her entrance. The room was much smaller than most on the ship, which was still huge from Shida's perspective, and was very barren. The only furnishing was provided by a large desk, attached to multiple computer terminals surrounding it on the framework of metal rods, two of which faced Shida. Behind the desk stood a large person, that Shida only knew from briefly passing them before. Their appearance otherwise didn't ring a bell, so they couldn't have worked in administration for very long, since Shida was sure that what looked like a walking bone tree would have left an impression on her. She knew the species, even though she couldn't remember its name right now. She believed it was originated from a core world and pretty famous. "Petty Officer Shida," the person addressed her, their voice sounding like strings being plucked, and looked at her with bright, almost glowing blue eyes. "Greetings, Warrant Officer," Shida respectfully replied, with a look at the rank displayed on their identifier. "You requested leave for the duration of our presence at the Great Community Station." They related the information on one of their screens towards her. "Quite unusual for you." One of their many flexible arms started to glide towards their face, gliding across the bony plate, protecting it around where their mouth must have been. They were clearly studying her. Shida almost felt like she was being undressed by their gaze, and shivers went over her skin. "Yes, is that a problem?" she asked, throwing a distrustful gaze back at the strange person. "Not at all," they answered, their voice continually filling the air with a joyful sounding, melody-like noise. Quickly, some of their arms glided across the touchscreen embedded into the desk. They took their eyes off of Shida for the duration of only a few breaths before looking back up at her. "Done and done," they happily chimed, swinging their head to give the illusion of an expression. "Your leave is approved. Enjoy yourself and have fun." There was an undertone in their voice that felt like they were implying something lascivious with that. As somebody who came in before her already felt the need to tell them about her and James's little display in the waiting area? "Thank you, Warrant Officer," Shida said, quickly demonstrating her respect before turning to leave. "Success to you." The Warrant Officer quickly shouted after her, apparently not yet having received the memo that basically none of the ranking crew used that phrase when addressing Shida. Not wanting to appear impolite to her superior, she quickly turned around and loudly repeated, "Success to you," before leaving the office. She still felt her skin crawl from the interaction. What the hell was with them? She quickly waved James over to her while walking past him, wanting to get away from there as fast as she possibly could. While they made their way back to the living area, Shida recounted the strange events within the office to James, who listened intently. "Usually I'd make a comment like, 'Maybe they were just dazzled by your beauty,'" James pensively said, after she had finished her story. "But I think that wouldn't be very appropriate right now." Well, at least he had that much awareness. "It was just weird, okay?" Shida said, shuddering. "Super weird," James answered, and he actually sounded serious. "For as much as the people on board say that we allegedly stare all the time, I actually hate getting stared at. I mean actual staring, not just eye contact." "Right?" Shida said loudly. As the first in a long time, she felt what a relief it actually was to tell her stories to somebody who got what she was talking about 100% while he listened. Sure, he could do just as little about it as she could, but it felt good letting it out and having it heard. By the way, are we splitting the bill on the room? James suddenly asked out of the blue. It took Shida a moment to get in the right headspace to realise what he was talking about. What? You're not paying in full? She said teasingly, already in a much better mood than she had been. Well, that's why I'm asking, he answered sheepishly. It's always awkward to not be in the clear on that beforehand. In that case, you are paying, Shida said, and in the gesture she remembered from the movie he had shown them, playfully stuck out her tongue at him. From the face he made, she could have sworn that that lone gesture had much more of an effect on him than all the feigned flirting they had done earlier combined. Chuckling bashfully, he replied, I guess it can't be helped. It was almost disappointing that he went with her unfair requests that easily. Resistance to her was part of the game, but humans seemed to play it differently. Maybe a new approach was in order. They slowly reached the juncture that separated the ways to their respective cabins. James looked at her expectantly. The gesture was clear. How would they spend their night? Walking past him, she made her way in the direction of his cabin. I guess this also means we'll have to get even more used to each other, she commented, while signaling him to follow her already, as he looked after her with a bemused expression. He slowly trotted after her while amusedly asking, Aren't you forgetting something? Shida turned towards him, looking back while walking backwards. I'm not, she playfully answered, looking him right in his eyes and giving him an impish wink. Then she turned forward again, and as she did, she could hear his steps accelerating behind her.